Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucia Lohman, and I'm the Executive Director of the ATBC. I would like to welcome all of you to the Lightning Talk session, Optimizing Educational Strategies and Public Policies for Conservation. I'd like to start by introducing our speakers. Rosana Arauco from the National History Museum in Peru, Aina Guinart from the Helsinki University, Wulan Pusparini from the University of Oxford, Marcelo Maggioli from the Instituto Pro Carnívoros in Brazil, Carolina Grando from Brazil, but now in Peru, Dumas Galvez from the Universidad de Panamá, and Laura Cor from the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. I'd like to remind all of you to please post your questions through the Q&A. We will start by watching a recording from all the speakers, and at the end, we will take questions from everyone. So please post your questions using the Zoom Q&A button, and whenever you post a question, please indicate to which speaker you're addressing your question to. Welcome and enjoy the session.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or good evening if it applies. Thank you for being here. My name is Roxana Arauco, and I'm a biologist from Peru. And today I'm going to share with you the philosophy and successes behind this Cochacasu's field techniques and tropical ecology course. As you know, climate change, deforestation, and fires could cause the world's largest rainforest to dry out, and we are all partnering and joining efforts trying to stop this or even reverse it. But how? This is a time where more and more we need of greater numbers of knowledgeable and passionate conservationists. Passionate conservationists usually is the result of talent and opportunity to learn, to interact, interchange, and experience. To provide such opportunities, San Diego Zoo Global Peru have created this intense course, the annual Field Techniques and Tropical Ecology course at Cochacacho Biological Station. We recruit the talent from all over Peru. We invite them to compete for one of the 10 scholarships offered each year. The students have come from 14 out of the 24 Peruvian states. We contacted and invite their academic mentors, experts in many fields, including diversity, ecology, and evolution. There is no better way to learn about the main components, processes, and mechanisms of tropical rainforests than discussing with and walking along passionate researchers. Up to date, we counted with participation of 21 experts throughout these first 6 years. 36 in total if we count those that volunteer to lecture while at the station. But nothing will work without art and communication. In a world where the implementation of solutions to major conservation problems requires the understanding and support of the general public, including local and global authorities, communicating successfully the scope, the results, the implications of the research becomes crucial. For that, art and communication is an integral part of this course. The Master of the Forest. There is no better way to teach and learn about the richness, exuberance, complexity, integrity, and fragility of tropical rainforests than by living in one of them. And we support the immersion of 10 participants each year for 3 months into a remote and one of the most intact rainforests in the world, a forest that itself is at the heart of almost 2 million hectares of protected area, the Manu National Park. The course has a classic 3-part structure, a bootcamp of basics, stage into the defining scientific questions, designing the research and implementing a group research, to finally carry out their own individual projects. But the base of all 3 months spent in coexistence with the forest invariably results in the realization that they are themselves an integral part of the ecosystem and not necessarily at the top of the food chain. As Nicolas said, your life is just one of several thousands and could all in a sudden be taken away by small creatures or impressive predators on the prowl, or simply be crushed by a magnificent giant fig tree. Though intangible, this is the main outcome of the course, the recognition of this inextricable interconnectedness of nature and people, a recognition and internalization that will positively influence their future decisions. The course success may be measured by the students' trajectories. Feedback we received, including surveys, indicates that 90% remain active in research and conservation, either independently or associated with national or international institutions. More than 50% have gone on pursuing postgraduate studies and additional coursework, and several have earned international awards. Around 20% earn scholarships to carry out their honor thesis from us. Although we don't have control group, we can safely conclude that students of this course were galvanized into pursuit of activities supporting a career in ecology and conservation. Here we have 3 NGO founders. CASHU alumni appear to be positioning themselves in Peru and abroad to be agents of change. We have ourselves learned many lessons along the way and continue to seek feedback that can further improve outcomes. We will continue providing support from CASHU in the form of academic advice and encouragement to keep these promising young scientists in this path. Thanks to the network of scientists, communicators, and artists, to the students themselves, to members of the CASHU team, and to the forest, of course. And with that, I will take questions, feedback, and collaboration.
Hi everyone, my name is Aina Brias-Guinard and I am from Helsinki University. And today I will present you an article that is under review, and it's titled Pathways to Conservation, Typifying Practitioners' Views on the Role of Education. By now, we all know that biodiversity is declining and that the only way forward is transformative change. And education can be one of the solutions. For this reason, conservation organizations have been using environmental education as a means to achieve conservation success and to enhance human-environment relationships, particularly targeting local communities living close to protected areas. Most education practitioners believe that education impacts conservation, but there is limited evidence. So in this research, we aim to unpack the role of education in conservation by typifying the pathways of change. And by that, we mean the paths that connect education interventions with a change in the health of the environment, the local communities, and the individuals. We conducted this research in Madagascar because it's a top global priority for conservation, because of its unique biodiversity that is declining, and is still one of the poorest countries of the world. In terms of environmental education, the strategies in the formal school curriculum are still weak, even if there are policies to implement that. So the main promoter of environmental education in the country are conservation organizations. And we were particularly interested to know what were the perspectives of these practitioners. So for that, we use the theory of change as a participatory tool to build this kind of diagrams that could connect the activities, education activities in green, with the final goal in blue, and building these pathways in orange. So we did semi-structured interviews that took 2 hours long with 15 different organizations. And the results were 15 different theories of change. And looking across them, we found 5 different pathways of change that emerge. So the first one was the one that focuses on the role of knowledge, in the way that knowledge can change our attitudes that will affect our behaviors, and also the importance of skills. The second pathway focuses on changing emotions and also changing traditional practices, such as the slash and burn agriculture. Interviewees mentioned the importance of experiencing nature in firsthand to foster love for nature, but also a sense of responsibility and ownership. The third pathway emphasized the importance of fostering leaders, so enhancing leadership skills, confidence, and respect, and fostering a network for advocacy. The fourth pathway focused on diversifying outcomes, so from access to education to stewardship practices such as planting trees to alternative livelihoods. And the fifth one focuses in moving from the individual level to the community and societal level. So, for example, engaging the collaboration of actors such as parents, teachers, but also associations or government. And also interviewees also highlighted the importance of having environmental education into the national education policy. So overall, we see that organizations that have a common goal, biodiversity conservation, have different rationales on how change happens. And this is aligning with the researchers that are saying that there is a complex net of factors that influence behavior. Also, many interviewees highlighted the importance of empowering local communities on the management of natural resources, aligning with the calls for more inclusive conservation. Even if we focus on education, many of the projects incorporated an aspect of alternative livelihoods, aligning with the rationale that says that if we raise income, we're going to solve the problem of environmental degradation. Many interviewees also emphasize that it's important to move beyond the individual level. But of course, those pathways that we draw are kind of ideal, and there are many factors that can prevent those pathways to make the impact. For example, social norms. Also, it's important to mention that in order for education to be successful, interventions should be tailored to the sociocultural context. And in this sense, we see that our results are lacking culturally grounded approaches. For example, none of the interviewees mentioned local ecological knowledge. Or for some organizations, traditional practices such as slash and burn are seen as things that we should change in the benefit of conservation. So overall, our results contribute to understand the role of education in conservation, suggesting that we need a range of pathways in order to arrive to our final goal, and also providing foundation for a more comprehensive evaluation. Finally, we just want to thank all the participants of this project, as well as Chances for Nature, for giving us the credits of these photos.
My name is Willan. I am a DPhil student at the University of Oxford. I'm going to talk about my study, priority areas and actions to conserve globally significant biodiversity in Sulawesi. Have you ever heard of the cerulean paradise flycatcher? This little bird was once thought to be extinct for more than 100 years. However, in 1998, they were rediscovered in one specific mountain of a tiny island. It was found in the small island of Sangir, north part of the Wallace, one of the 25 hotspots for biodiversity conservation. Now let's zoom in. The red square is where the mountain, called Sahendaruman, located, the only place on Earth where we found the cerulean paradise flycatcher. Alas, at the same area where an active gold mining concessions are located. Endemic to this part of the world, if that little bird extinct from this island, it ceases to exist from Earth. The fate of cerulean paradise flycatcher is far from unique. The Sulawesi, where this study conducted, harbor high endemicity, including 98% of its non-flying mammals, and the threat of mining is only one of many concerted factors threatening biodiversity in many parts of Sulawesi. To conserve the biodiversity, protected areas or PAs are the mainstay approach. However, currently the PA network in Sulawesi only covers 10% of the area, and as you can see here, the Sahendaruman mountain was not a PA. This brings us to my research questions. How effective are the current PAs? And when we need to protect more area, where and how? Using an annealing algorithm through Marksand, we did a systematic conservation planning. We balanced between the costs in the form of integrated forest and land use land cover with the conservation features we are interested. Currently, under the PA systems, only less than 10% of forest cover and karst ecosystems are protected, and less than 20% of the area with high carbon stock are protected. We ran 3 scenarios in order of implementations. The first is the 17% target from the IEG Target 11. The second is the 30% target from the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And the last is the ambitious half-Earth target. And here are what we found. When we increased the protection target to 17%, we found the new priority areas to be conserved mostly constitute the extended border of the current PAs. So for the first implementations, we recommend an improved buffer zone management as a way to protect this area. In the next implementation, we aim for 30% protection. In the scenario, we start to see new priority areas not connected to any non-PA. And the last, the 50% target, we found that these PAs, the current PAs, and the new priority areas, mostly in the center part of the island, are connected through a set of corridors. And you can see here the Sahendarman Mountain is also a priority area. Now I want to direct your attention to these two areas, the Banggai and the large, almost 6,000 square kilometer of Makonga. These are the two largest priority areas outside the current PA. This pattern are emphasized by the second analysis when we remove the PA system from calculations, essentially thinking of the Sulawesi as a blank slate. Two strategies are recommended. The first is by increasing the status of these areas into, for example, a national park, and the second, either as a community-led or co-managed PA or as a private ecosystem concessions under the OACMs. Having these areas recognized under the other effective area-based conservation measure will give the legitimacy needed to effectively and equitably protect an extensive area. There is no magic number to ensure how many we should set aside for humanity to survive the ecological and biodiversity collapse. The larger, the better. However, by doing so, we must base our decisions on science and keep the principle of equity towards the marginal and indigenous people that depends on nature. With this, I end my talk. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marcelo Maggioli, and I will present our study on the role of protected and unprotected areas for mammal conservation in a megadiverse neotropical hotspot. The background of our study is that protected areas are essential to maintain biodiversity, ecological functions, and ecosystem services. However, the protected areas alone cannot halt biodiversity loss. With the expansion of agricultural lands, human-modified landscapes dominate most of the tropical forest ecosystems, which are composed by small and unprotected forest remnants. But these areas are essential to slow down biodiversity loss and extinctions, and to be integrated with conservation efforts in the long term. The neotropical realm holds impressive amounts of biodiversity endemisms, and safeguards several biodiversity hotspots. But there are many knowledge gaps in these regions. One of these important hotspots is the Atlantic Forest of Brazil, which holds several regions with scarce or low-quality information on its biodiversity. Here, we unveil the main patterns of occurrence and distribution of medium and large-sized mammals in the Atlantic Forest of Southern Bahia, Brazil. This region is considered a hot point within the Atlantic Forest hotspot, because of its mega diverse characteristics and emissions, and to be a top priority region for conservation in Brazil. We assessed the information on mammal assemblages in 72 forest remnants, 12 protected areas, and 60 unprotected ones from varying sizes. 68 of these areas we collect primary data, and 4 of them we compile information from the literature. For the collection of primary data, we use camera trapping, line transit, and active search. To analyze the data, first we calculated the percentage of protected and unprotected areas in which each species occurred, Then we compare the assemblages in terms of richness attributes of overall species richness and the richness of threatened species, relative abundance and biomass between protected and unprotected areas. We also assess the relationship between richness attributes and area and biomass and area using generalized linear mixed models. We also assess the relationship between richness attributes and pet size thresholds. We recorded 45 medium and large size mammals across the region, in which 42% of them are regionally threatened. 38% of them are threatened in Brazil and 29% worldwide. Comparing the protected and unprotected areas, we observed a high richness of overall species in protected areas and also the richness of threatened species in these protected areas, and also a positive relationship between overall species richness and richness of threatened species with pet size. Concerning the species occurrence, we observed that they were proportionally higher in the protected areas, especially of the threatened ones. The same was observed in the protected areas regarding species abundance, with low variation in protected areas and high relative abundance of the threatened species. For the biomass, the pattern was maintained with higher biomass for the protected areas, but it was characteristically low across all southern Bahia for all assemblies. At last, for the pet size thresholds, we observed that for overall richness, they were very characteristic of what is expected by each threshold group. But for the threatened species, we observed a loss of species that are more sensitive to habitat loss and those of large size below the second threshold. We conclude that the protected areas are critical to maintain mammal diversity, while the unprotected ones are important as stepping stones and to slow down species loss in the long term. We recommend more studies in both protected and unprotected areas, long-term monitoring in protected areas to assess population fluctuations, and the unprotected ones should be targeted of studies focusing on ecological restoration and to restore landscape connectivity. We thank all of our institutions and the funding agents that supported the development of our study. This study is published in Biological Conservation. Thanks for watching, and thanks ATBC 2021 for the opportunity.
Hi everyone, my name is Carolina Grando and I'm a postdoc researcher from the National University of San Cristóbal de Huamanga in Ayacucho, Peru, and I'm here to present my work, Reduction on Effectiveness of Amazon Protected Areas under Climate Change Threatens Plant-Animal Interactions. As introduction, protected areas are an essential strategy to conserve biodiversity and ecosystem services throughout generations, and some authors consider that protected areas are acting as a buffer to species adaptation to climate change conditions. However, the accelerated pace of climate change due to human actions may reduce the long-term effectiveness of protected areas in safeguard species and their biotic interactions. So, the objective of our work was to use ecological niche modeling to evaluate the long-term effectiveness of Amazon protected areas, focusing in plant and animal interaction, with emphasis on pollination and seed dispersal in the emergent tree Dipteryx micrantha. In the methods, we used 5 algorithms to forecast present and future habitat-suitable areas for Dipteryx micrantha and its interaction with 5 bee pollinators and 6 bat dispersers. And for the future scenario, we used an ensemble of 3 projections in the RCP 4.5 scenario from 2061 to 2080. And we estimated the intersected reduction, increase, or maintenance of the species distribution within the protected areas. For Dipteryx micrantha, we observed mainly a reduction of habitat suitability for the future scenario in protected areas. So we observed a split in the future scenario in two largest suitable areas, one in the north of Peru and another one more in the south of Peru, separated by several smaller disconnected ones. For the overlaying of Dipteryx micrantha with bee pollinators, we observed that the reduction of habitat suitability surpassed the increase in the maintenance for the future scenario in protected areas. So in the table 1, where is it possible to observe the number of protected areas with reduction, increase, or maintenance, the highest reduction was observed for the interaction of Dipteryx micrantha and Lema moxari in 221 protected areas. For the overlaying of Dipteryx micrantha with the most of bat species, we also observed that the reduction of habitat suitability surpassed the increase in the maintenance for the future scenario in protected areas. So we observed the highest reductions for the overlaying of Dipteryx micrantha in Artibius obscurus and Artibius planirostris, both in 221 protected areas. But we observed an exception for the bat Artibius concolor, with an increase in 151 protected areas in the future scenario. And this increase was due to expansion of habitat suitability areas in the future scenario. In the conclusion, our results suggest a reduction of effectiveness of the most Amazon-protected areas under a future climate change scenario, with disruptions in both biotic interactions like pollination and seed dispersal, and also in evolutionary process in the Amazon rainforest. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, today I'm going to present to you a summary of a study monitoring roadkills during 3 years in a road adjacent to a national park in Panama. Although roadkill monitoring can provide important information about spatial and temporal trends on roadkill events, surprisingly, for many countries in the world, such type of data is not available, mostly because no one is working in this field, road ecology. For example, in gray in this map, what you see are countries in which the author of this review from 2020 did not find any data available about roadkill trends in those countries. And this lack of roadkill data is also typical to Central America, with perhaps the section of a few studies from Costa Rica in which roadkill trends were actually investigated. For this reason, I chose to work on roadkill data for a certain area in central Panama. I carried out this monitoring along the Via Mar Torrijos, which is marked in red from the town of Paraíso onto the City of Knowledge. This road goes along next to the Panama Canal. Besides, I also monitor in blue the City of Knowledge until the Metropolitan Park. I quantified the taxa of the roadkill. Moreover, I evaluated whether the monthly temperature and precipitation influence the frequencies of the roadkill events. By using a spatial analysis, I found a hotspot of roadkills around the kilometer 4 between A1 and A2, which is a curved section of the road, which is also surrounded by water in both sides. The yellow color here show the highest frequencies of roadkill events. The two most common roadkill species found in this study were the iguana, the green iguana, and the Tamandua mexicana, the northern Tamandua. I redid the analysis separately for these two species, and I found similar trends that the trends I found for the overall roadkill data. Here, this is a summary of some of the species that I found during the monitoring. And to highlight only two examples is the lesser capybara, which is normally a species that based on the IUCN status, there's not much data available to determine its condition. For the Geoffroy's tamarin, another interesting roadkill event, the fact that it's an arboreal species that apparently goes on the ground to cross the roads. I did not find differences in the number of roadkills events per season in the dry and rainy season, but I found that the number of roadkills tended to decrease with the average monthly temperature and the average monthly precipitation. There's evidence in the literature that these two factors can be influential in the probability of roadkill events. And one might wonder, given the importance of these two factors in the probability of roadkill events, how climate change may affect these dynamics. And climate change may be already playing a role in the dynamics of roadkills events. For example, in this study in Italy, the author found for the Mediterranean snakes that there was a shift in the peaks of monthly pattern of roadkills, and they suggested that it could be related to changes in the mating season due to global warming. And to conclude, I would like to give you this take-home message. There was no effect of taxa year or season, but there was an effect of temperature and precipitation on the monthly counts of roadkills events. So this leaves the door open for future research on the effect of global warming on the dynamics of roadkill probabilities, something that should be studied both in the tropics and temperate zones. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Kaur and I'm a PhD student at King's College London and the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. Today I'll be presenting on applying the tropical important plant areas approach to useful plant species in Colombia. 2 in 5 of all plant species in the world are threatened with extinction. And this is really important, as plants are fundamental to nearly all life on Earth. In 2002, the Important Plant Area Programme was launched to protect the best sites for plant conservation in Europe. And in 2017, the Tropical Important Plant Area Programme, or TPAS, was launched and the criteria were updated, with the major change being the inclusion of socio-economically important plant species, or useful plant species. But little work's been done on this aspect. Meanwhile, Colombia has the second most plant species in the world, but no identified IPA network, and is also going through rapid ecological, social, and economic change. So the main aim of this part of my PhD is to define potential tropical important plant areas for useful plant species in Colombia. For this research, I'm working as part of the Useful Plants and Fungi of Colombia project, or UPFC. So of course, all species are important, but we are focusing on species for which uses by humans can be reported, and we're applying a modified version of the 10 high-level use categories which are defined in the Economic Botany Data Collection Standard, and are shown here. Before undertaking geographic analyses, we first had to identify a list of useful plants of conservation concern in Colombia. We started with a checklist of over 7,000 useful plants, which we compiled as part of the UPFC project. This was narrowed down to native species only, based on the Colombian catalogue of plants, and we further filtered the list to include only endemic or threatened species. Of the endemic species which had not been assessed, we estimated their extent of occurrence based on records from GBIF, and in our list of species of conservation concern, we included only restricted range endemics, in line with TPAS criteria. So before presenting results, I'd just like to stress that these are very preliminary analyses, and more steps are required to develop these potential core-scale TPAS into a national network. We base our analyses on a priori regionalization, so we use an ecosystem map of Colombia to define our units of analysis. We then applied 2 of the IPA criteria. So firstly, for criterion A, we selected the UAs that had more than 10% of records for our useful plants of conservation concern. And for criterion B, we selected the UAs which had the greatest richness per ecosystem type. And all selected UAs are mapped out here on this map, and criterion A accounted for a much larger area than criterion B. We then used the Marksan planning tool to undertake initial prioritization of the sites which we highlighted in the previous slide. So we ran two different scenarios, one which treated all of the highlighted UAs equally, and the other which gave greater preference to the UAs that overlapped with protected areas. And that's to kind of include complementarity in these analyses. So you can see a map here of the selection frequency of the UAs from a total of 100 runs of the algorithm for each scenario. And looking at the number of sites which were selected more than 50 times out of the 100 runs, many more sites tended to be included in scenario 2 in order to meet our set conservation targets and objectives. And that indicates that the existing protected area network in Colombia does not sufficiently protect useful plant species of conservation concern. So to round up, these preliminary results identified hotspots for useful plants of conservation concern, and they're the first step in identifying potential TPAS nationally in Colombia. Much more analyses needs to be conducted and refined, but just as importantly, in order to actually implement a TPAS network that achieves conservation goals, especially when we're looking at useful plant species, we really need to consider socio-economic factors. So in the next stage of my PhD, I'm aiming to investigate how local ecological knowledge and the use of plants actually compare to results which used just IPA approaches. And I'll be doing that in 3 case study regions. So thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have on the day.
Thank you so much, everyone, for such exciting talks. This was really amazing. And I would like to start our Q&A session with a question for Roxana. And this is a question that was placed by Aina. And the question, there are 2 questions actually. The first part is, how old are the participants? Are they bachelor students? And the second part is, so how cool that you were able to measure the impact of your program by serving participants' career choices. How many years after they participate in the program can you track them?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Aina, and everybody to be here. So in general, thank you everybody, because indeed, I can see that all of us are aligned into the same elements of these strategies for education and policy. And to answer the question of Aina, this course is strategically oriented to local Peruvian conservationists. We also believe that it is a main component if we aim to make a change, to actually increase the numbers of local conservationists. And it is directed to, you call it bachelor students, I mean students of biology or similar careers like environmental engineering or even veterinary, in their last year or last semester, including also those that have graduated already, but are just 2 years after graduation. So young scientists. Also, yes, we struggle to actually find an objective way to measure the impact. And I hope that talking with you, we can actually find a way to do so. As I said in the presentation, the main outcome is intangible, because it's this internalization of this interconnectedness that you can only get when you actually feel that you are not at the top of the food chain. And that let me highlight here, can only happen inside an intact forest. And we should actually map in the world where are those intact forests. And I do agree with all of you as well that the disturbed forests are also very important. But for this feeling of being part of the ecosystem, it is crucial to live in an intact forest. And well, I went for the tangents here, and that was the measuring the impact. What was the last one? Sorry. Let me check.
Yeah, so how many years after they participate in the program can you track them?
Very good question. We didn't survey them after the first year, of course. The series of courses started in 2013, and we carried out the first survey in 2017, didn't include the ones in 2016. So after 5 years, actually.
That is excellent. Thank you. And we now have a question for Woolen. And the question is, well, so first of all, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. Have you been able to discuss your results with any protected area managers or governmental agencies?
Thank you so much for the questions, Aina. Yes, that's a very important question, because what does this study going to do if the governments won't take it as recommendations, right? So when we first do the study, we actually consulted with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Indonesia. I think it was like 2 years ago, and then we produced like the first versions of the report. But then we updated the study to also taking into account the post-2020, the new targets, the 30%. And this is the new result that we are going to present it first to the government before we actually publish it. So the answer is we haven't, but they're aware that there are these studies and they're going to hear more about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Woolen. And now we have a question for Aina, which is, what would you recommend to a tropical biologist so he or she can engage constructively with local communities?
Well, thank you for the question. I wish I knew the answer. I don't. My research focuses on seeing what conservation organizations do and not what researchers do. Although it's true that, for example, where I work in Madagascar, there are many researchers going there. So in a way, they're also actors, and I would say they also have an impact. So I think it's interesting that we think about how do we behave as researchers when we go to the field. But I don't know. I mean, out of my personal opinion, if you want to hear, I would say be respectful. Someone don't talk about equity, I think. So that's one, and maybe don't make promises that they're not gonna like complete later on. But if you have the answer, I would love to know, because I also wonder this each time I go to the field. Yeah.
In fact, this question actually applies to some of the others. So do any of the others have any recommendations to how to engage constructively with local communities?
So if I may, local communities have different stages. You know, there is the schoolers, there is the adults, and there's many ways, but one way is actually to include them in the research team, but not really like workers, you know. They are very knowledgeable about their tropical rainforest. And I say this because I also led the monitoring of river turtles. And as a biologist, as I may be, as all the papers that I may read, but there is nothing that compares with the knowledge that people get from the field throughout all their lives and throughout all their lineages. So we call the team the Tarikaya team, which is the local name of the river turtle. And we have transfer technology, and we have actively make a campaign for everybody else to see them as part of the team, because that's a barrier as well that we need to, to change. They are the knowledgeable ones, and to include in the research. That's one way, I think.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we actually have a general question here from Juan Pablo Narvaez. And the question is, what do you think we should do to reconcile area-based and community-based conservation approaches? Any of you would like to answer that? So how to reconcile area-based and conservation-based and community-based conservation approaches?
I actually don't understand very well the questions. You mean like creating new protected areas versus fostering the participation of the community to protect those areas?
Yeah, essentially, so how, while we make conservation decisions, how can we take into account, the community-based information and the area-based information into a unified conservation strategy? Take into account communities and species, and how do you reconcile all the information in order to make a sound conservation plan?
Can I try to guess the answer?
Please do. Yeah.
I think that's kind of like, so area-based. Well, the decision to protect an area can be for anything, right? Like species, or like for biodiversity, or for like cultural reasons. That's like area-based conservation. You pick an area and you think it's important enough to be protected, and how you do it, that's where the community-based or like government-based, that's what defined it. So I don't think it's separate. You can have community-based area conservation area. In fact, in the other effective area-based conservation measure, IUCN, they also recognize the community-based and indigenous PAs as a legitimate form of protections area. So I don't think there's need to be dichotomy. There's a lot of ways to conserve an area, and community-based is one of it. And I think it's a good way to include the indigenous people and community-based people.
And if I may, to complement one comment of Carolina was about the vulnerability of protected areas. And it's precisely because most of the protected areas, well, it depends on the regions, but are surrounded by towns and cities. And they are the ones to be the first defenders. So you want to include the communities that are the neighboring the protected areas, whether they are indigenous, whether they are migrant towns, or whether it is a capital. If you know something about Peru, Puerto Maldonado is a capital, the capital of biodiversity, close in Tamopata and Manu National Park, but it's a force for mining and illegal logging as well. So it has to be both, as Willem has highlighted. Or it's not enough to base conservation just in creating protected areas.
Marcelo, please.
This is an interesting question because in our study area, as an example, it's where the colonization of Brazil started. So it has a long historic of anthropogenic impacts. And in our study, we observed that the large protected areas are the ones that holds most of the threatened species and the large size ones. But even then, some of these large protected areas do not have some of the large size species like muriqui monkeys or lowland tapirs or white-leaf peccaries. Even the large ones do not have anymore this large size species, or some of the threatened ones, because we have this conflict with several activities that are occurring in the region, several settlements of people surrounding most of the protected areas, and also conflicts with indigenous peoples that are still inhabiting this region. So we're thinking that the next step is trying to bring the community, the people that live around the protected areas, to understand their importance, and also what are the trade-offs for these people. Because most of the time the protected areas are a dichotomy for them. They cannot go inside the protected areas. They cannot benefit from these protected areas. So it is very hard to convince people the protected areas in this region are good. So I think this lack of communication and showing our results in a good manner for some of them to understand, showing data, showing numbers to them really means nothing. So we have tried to communicate and integrate these people into our conservation initiatives.
And to that, sorry, just briefly, protected areas is really a broad term, and there is like, you know, a gradient of levels of restriction, and the national parks are the most restricted one, and it depends as well in the region. In Peru, there is still national protected areas that do have their big mammals, components, and primates, and but what I wanted to put onto the table is that because of the need of the guardians that are surrounding these hardcore protected areas, there is the how do you call that? The biosphere concept. The biosphere, Reserva Biosfera biosphere reserves, which is a mixed, and it's you know, of protected areas as national parks and like reserve areas and buffer areas, and you know, so that what Marcelo said, so that the people can actually feel the benefit of being a neighbor of a protected area. But it's it can be complicated.
Yeah, the problem is mainly with the strictly protected areas. We have a lot of private protected areas that are trying to reduce this conflict, but yeah, there are many problems, especially with poaching in the region. We have a lot of things to do yet.
So just for you to know, in Peru, there is a strong recent trend to actually favor the inclusion socially and economically of those communities surrounding the protected areas. As you, Marcelo, have said, the protected areas mistakenly probably have been seen as a barrier to what they or many people perceive as development. And happily, there is many actors today, NGOs, nationals and internationals, that are trying to offer these alternative economic activities that Aina suggested in part of the talk, but it's a long journey. So I'm glad that to meet you all here, because I guess we all add a grain of sand to discuss.
That is wonderful. And we have now a question for Laura. And the question is for the TIPAS in Colombia. What is your suggestion to integrate your proposed approach to existing protected area systems?
Hi, thanks for the question. I think it follows on really nicely from the last question and the discussion, because, you know, as Roxana and Marcelo were saying, there are very many different types of protected areas. And that's also true in Colombia. It's that, you know, there's different kind of scales of protected areas. So there's nationally protected, regionally and locally. And also, so just to give some background to the TPAS program, it's like a global initiative, so part of the Important Plant Area program and initiative. And so IPAs have been defined in hundreds of countries across the world. And it doesn't automatically give kind of legal protection,
but in some countries it has been included into the protected area system. So for Colombia, it's an interesting question. So the analyses I've been doing more recently has kind of moved on a bit from what I showed in the presentation, where now rather than just looking at ecosystems as the units of analysis, I've kind of combined ecosystems and municipalities. So to give it that kind of political significance as well. So I think it could be something that could work maybe as a regional designation. That would be really good, because that still allows, sustainable use, which is really important in what we're hoping to, I guess, from the previous question as well, to include communities in this process rather than have a no-go zone where, the use of plants isn't allowed. And something that's really interesting as well in Colombia, a few years ago, a national flora sanctuary was designated for medicinal plants. And that was very much done in conjunction with local communities, and is one of the first of its type in the world. So, having more like that, maybe being able to integrate our suggested ITPAs into that kind of approach would also be really interesting and exciting. But I guess it also depends, on the people involved, whether the national government would be interested, or whether, local municipalities would be interested. But, any one of those approaches would hopefully be okay. And also at the local community level, I think that would be the most important for this type.
So I'm excited to hear that actually plants and the big trees and the buttress trees and the medicinal plants are actually very close to the heart of community people. And in Peru as well, there is some private conservation areas based on major trees like the dipteryx that was mentioned earlier. So we are with you, Laura.
Thank you.
So, but one thing, sorry, to all of us, we have engaged ourselves in discussing common and unfortunately major challenges for tropical rainforest, and within the scope of education, and that's probably the reason why we highlighted education, as complex as it is in the several stages, schoolers or adults or professionals and like that. And I think like the challenge is an outcome would be, so for effectively transmit this knowledge that we have, and also which is enriched, I'm sure, in the case of all of you by the interactions with local people and, indigenous people as well, but to foster this interchange and that, and we can make a one single frontage and, to understand what is the importance of large protected areas, no matter what, it is important. And if there is no enough land, then why the corridors are important, made up of this small area patches, why the big plants, the big trees are important in this idea of the carbon, and why it is very natural to have these conflicts with mining, because, we are all human beings. We need the resources. They are going into a transition, and so it is motivating for me to actually find people like you that are also investing their passion and their knowledge to find ways to make this education and the policy more efficient.
That is wonderful. Yeah, please. Yeah. So all of you just showed such interesting and such important results for conservation. And so we haven't talked about Duma's work yet, but he showed also how climate change may play will play an important role in the patterns of roadkill. And Carolina also showed like how showed that a reduction of the effectiveness of most of the Amazon protected areas might also change under a future climate change scenario. And so given all this information, a question that I have for each of you is, how can we get the scientific information and best communicate so that this information really reaches policymakers and we can really have a true impact. So I wanted to ask each of you how to better bridge science and policy making, and also what do you think is the role of science communication in this process? And maybe we can get each one of you and just talk a little bit about that. Would you like to start, Dumas?
Yeah, sure. So first, I would like to say that I have a background in pure science, ecology, evolution, and behavior. So adopting this project and roadkill monitoring was a new challenge for me somehow, because this is data that is not for me. It has to be definitely shared with the public, and particularly the people doing the policies. So here in Panama, for example, one way that you get things done is exposing the authorities in the media. Like you tell, they see something on TV, this person is not doing what should be doing. So I think we can here, at least here, we can use the same approach. And for example, my research, I'm trying to get this on the television, on the most popular TV channels, to highlight the problem that this roadkill situation phenomena represents, and trying to highlight how, for example, if we don't take care of the animals, there's less people, less tourists, less money for the country, and something like that. Trying to get the media involved in the advertising of our research, so this reaches the policymakers.
That is wonderful.
Well,
yeah, Carolina, please.
Well, in our case, I think we expect first is to publish the paper, because, for example, here a challenge here in Peru is that the institutions are very bureaucratic generally. So in our case, we are working with Dipteryx migranta. They call a popular name that is called chihuahuaco for all the species. So what's happening is that there are in fact three different plant species. This tree is endangered because they are exploring because of the wood, because of the hardwood, the quality. So they are taking, the policy makers here in Peru are taking the last 5 years just to approve, to change the condition of these species to endangered. So they are considering only 2 species and letting Dipteryx ferrea. They are not considering these species as endangered, when in fact is. So this was the first challenge. And the second challenge we will have is to present our results and saying, hey, we need to make a plan for all the protected areas to conserve this species, to conserve the species. So these are our results, and how can we work with these results? I think this will be the next challenge. In fact, first of all, to convince the policymakers here that the climate change is real and will affect the species and their biotic interaction soon, in the next 40 or 50 years. So I think before we present to community, we have a challenge to convince the policymakers here, in fact.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Roxana?
Indeed, bureaucracy, huh? Not only in Peru, probably, but I wanted to highlight, I mean, I agree with both of you. And in my case, I think that's one of the strong motivations of the course, to actually stress communication tools and skills. It's not really easy, especially because more than ever, for instance, the paper is one communication format, which is not going to be available, or even the authorities are not going to really understand it. You need, other tools or skills like Dumas has said, the media, it will use a language that is more accessible to the general public. So we need the general public to actually understand all these topics that we are talking about and support them. And for that, I think it is fair to actually invest all our resources to communicate effectively. Even at the, many people may say to local people, but even at the decision makers, there is different careers. Lawyer, engineer, teacher do not necessarily speak the same language, and an actor has to be able to actually communicate through different channels. And I think that's key to actually bridge the science to the policy maker. There is more, but that's crucial. And I actually invite everybody that would like to find capsules of making a workshop, so that these young students, and even locals or indigenous with the challenge of a different language, which sometimes it's not Spanish, to actually give that a step, to be able to communicate and share what they want to share.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. And Aina?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit more. I think this also connects with the question of Juan before on how do you engage constructively with local communities, because I think like part of our responsibility as researcher is to return the results that you have been researching, no? For example, there were recently like some example of Madagascar that there are lots of research on lemurs because they are so endemic and so on, but that tourist guides, they still like use information that was like very old fashioned. So it means that they are not having access to this science, no, that is being published. And part of that, I think, is the structure of how science is done, no, and all the open access and all these barriers that don't allow science to reach to the audience. But maybe also one thing is that sometimes we think about communicating as the last step of our process. But maybe if we think about science the way that Roxana was suggesting, and the way if you design science in a way that you are involving policymakers and local communities in a more transdisciplinary approach, then in a way you are communicating from the beginning, no, because they are part of the whole process. So you don't need to think it at the end, but through all the process. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Aina. Wulan? Oops, I think you're muted, sorry.
Yeah, that's so true. I just want to reiterate what Aina said, like involve them right at the beginning when you design your study, either that a policymaker or like community that live in your area, that's gonna increase the buy-in of your results much more higher. And also this is one thing that I'm learning here, and how to communicate our result to the policymaker. Sometimes as scientists, we think that our result is so clear. It's just, it's black and white. How come you not understand? But I think when you put yourself in the policymaker desk, they have to, like our science is just like one piece of a puzzle that they need to wait on. Like they have to make like hard decisions every day. So how you present your result is going to be very, very significant, not just what your results is about, but how you present it. I think like presenting your piece of a puzzle as a bigger picture, like connected to other things, and you actually like reiterate what is the risk if you're ignoring this one piece of a puzzle, it's going to make that science result much easier to digest for the policymaker. Like they don't want to hear about your confidence interval or nothing like that, but just like, so what's the implication if I like ignore this piece of a puzzle compared to this economic progress or like human health and things like that. I think we need to sometimes remove our scientific hat and just see like the real world going on, and how is our one piece of a puzzle that we trying so hard to make and write when we write our thesis actually complement the kind of decision that policymakers need to make like every day.
That is wonderful. And so maybe Laura, if you have just one final comment, and because we just reached the time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Just really quickly then, and it leads on from what Wulan and the others were saying, that to really understand the political system and how it works, because then in that way that you can actually target what you're doing. So to understand what, not just politicians, but also the civil servants who are, working with them, what gaps they have, what they need to know, and how the system actually works, that you can help to like plug those gaps and make your research count, I guess.
That is fantastic. So I think that's a wonderful note for us to end, and we are 1 minute past the time. So I would like to encourage all of you to continue the discussion in Whova, so you can create a group and continue the discussions from this super interesting question, from this really interesting session. And I really would like to thank all of the speakers for the wonderful talks and the audience for the questions. I also would like to thank Juan Pablo Narvaez, who's here helping us with the technology. And with that, I think we will close and continue our discussions in Whova. Thank you so very much to all of you. Bye-bye.